afternoon, everybody. Let's start the workshop. And Ben, welcome everybody. Last Tuesday, terrible things happened in the sense that I was hooked up in a train for 5 hours, ending up at Gouda and Zoetermeer with trains not going any direction, etc., etc. So many apologies for that, for those who were more successful in getting to the university. What I suggest and propose is that I try to squeeze the lecture in 1 hour, then have a break, and that we then do the workshop. One question, the Enron case of last week, and a question of this week, the new business. So that we somehow cover the topics of this week, the current week. However, now that we spent less hours on it, I will adjust the final written examination accordingly and restrict potential questions to the topic I will address right now. On top of that, I will record it as a regular lecture, just the lecture part, so the 1 hour only, and post that on and upload that on YouTube so that we can have a look at it.
When are you going to post the lectures?
Yesterday I did number 4, so roughly within 7 days that is then done. So there are now 4 weeks on internet, and that is with the same link of the first. So it's a channel, a YouTube channel. You figured it out?
No, actually. If you click on the first lecture, and it just takes you afterwards on YouTube. So there are no links on Blackboard for your other lecture.
Okay.
So I will change the language of that link from lecture 1 to all lectures. Shall we do it that way, Kirill?
Yeah, I think it's easy, because also I had a question of where to find the rest of the lecture, but where I finished the first lecture, we started YouTube automatically, switched me to
There we go. So I will change the word lecture 1 to all lectures, and then we're done. Okay, so today, this week, we look at the first chosen topic, in Latin capita selecta, and that is the life cycle approach. That is the topic so far plotted, presented around 2 key phases of a enterprise, and that is the establishment phase and the bankruptcy phase. So the beginning and the end. What we do is that we then, in those 2 phases, and I developed some nice icons for that, that we look at the concept and the law and some examples, as I did with previous topics. Again, based on the reading of the textbook, one of the main focus is to look at agency problems, and if I forgot to mention that, ask where necessary who in this part of the story is the principal and who's the agent. So the delegated management as agent of shareholders, or the majority shareholders as agent of the minority shareholders, and all those different relationships between the 2. Step 1 in the establishment is the question: who are the actors that are involved? And I would like to make a distinction between the entrepreneur as the actor and the other actors. And the entrepreneur is the individual with the idea, with a invention or a business solution or another sign of a, let's call it metaphysically, a energy that can be translated to turnover and profit. That I call the entrepreneur. And that can be one single person, that can be 2 persons, sometimes even 3, but that is a sort of select combination of events. And look at Steve Jobs of Apple, look at the Mr. Heineken, look at Mr. Daimler, look at all the big companies we look at today, once started with a person. Okay. And then the others are actors that actually earn their money via this entrepreneur. So from the perspective of the entrepreneur, all the other actors are a cost, not an income. But they could be a necessary cost. For instance, if you have a good idea, and for that idea you need huge initial investments, otherwise it will not fly. So let's suppose your idea is about a new satellite in space, and then you need a couple of billions to get the object created and launched in space. And then you need a lot of money. So financiers are then actors that appear on the scene. A variety of advisors, partly you, advisory services, KPMG or law firms or combinations of the two. And then there are two key figures, key actors in the public sphere. One is the individual, the officer that is appointed by the state, by the jurisdiction, in the broad sense of the word. That is the person that sets a stamp on the piece of paper what a legal person is. I introduced to you that a legal person is a piece of paper with an example. And a characteristic of that key feature of a corporation is that there is an official stamp on it, literally or symbolically. And that is an important sort of gatekeeper of each jurisdiction. And there are varieties. So in Delaware, it's a person that is sort of employed at the State Chamber of Commerce. In the Netherlands, it's called a civil notary with that public authority to create a legal person, and variations in between in other jurisdictions. So that is an important one. And then with a certain fee. And then the last public one is the registrar, a individual, and that looks not necessarily very sexy, but from a legal perspective, it's a crucial figure because all the preliminary steps and drafting of charters, articles of incorporation, and the design of your enterprise is irrelevant until the moment of the publication, so that you go public. And like with an individual, after birth you need to be registered as an individual, natural person, within 3 days in the citizen register. And also corporations only really exist when they are published. We talk about public company. And the emphasis I put on this aspect is not that you will have that much to do with registers, but that all the changes in the corporate structure are similar as if they are established, the corporation. So all the companies you review in your paper, they change their structure on a yearly basis, or every 2 years. And then all these steps needs to be taken. And that means that when you look at the analysis of a corporation, then you base your conclusions on the latest published characteristics of the corporation, up to and including who are the board members. You're only board member with an external authority, that is, when you are registered in the company register. How? As director, as board member. And so it's not only a matter of the establishment, and in the old companies that's 100 years ago, but it's on a yearly basis. And that means that between the moment that you substantively, materially decide you are the board member, and the moment that you're actually registered, that can be 1 week, can be a whole year, if no one goes to the public register. And that means that in that period you're nothing from the outside world, even if internally you are the new board member or appointed, etc. And that has to do with this sort of information. And when I link it to the book, then there is this affiliation strategy mentioned as a strategy in a jurisdiction to make sure that whoever joins your enterprise as shareholder, as creditor, as different relationships, sometimes even employee, that you are analyzing your future employer or company based on public information. And public information is all the information after the moment of registration in the broader sense of the word. And here I pick the register of the corporation itself, but it also applies to other types of registers. And in that sense, I define stock markets, SEC, these types of bodies also as a sort of register-like body, in the sense that when information is listed there or disclosed, then it is all of a sudden public. And to an extent, this also applies to other types of regulators, like the financial market authorities, other than the stock markets. In Dutch, the AFM, Dutch Stock Financial Service Authority. All right, now we get some sun. So we have all kinds of. Can you see? Yes, that is a solution. Thank you very much. Now we move to the next topic, and that is asset partitioning. Chapter 5. And asset partitioning has to do with the plan B of any relationship with a enterprise. Plan A, your first relationship, is the actual performance you are looking for. Your primary goal of investing in a corporation is the performance in terms of return on investment, dividend. Your primary goal of an employee, your relationship with the company, is that you get salary. The primary relationship and goal and content of the contract as a consumer is that the product works. Your primary goal as a supplier of aluminium to Apple is that you get your invoice paid. So that is the initial contractual liability. Asset partitioning is for the next phase. The next phase is if my primary performance fails to happen, if there is this default, or synonym distress, and the plus package is bankruptcy, also known as insolvency. What is then my plan B? What is then the recourse of the creditor? And let's show immediately the drawings I made. This is the primary relationship, the green arrow. And then plan B is, if this fails, do I have recourse on the assets of my debtor? And asset partitioning is then the question, where do I put my assets in this context? What is this context? This context is 1, litigation. Litigation on the green arrow, what was the primary performance? And the question, was there default? And the question, what is the legal consequence? As in, am I entitled to damages, to compensation? That's step 1. Step 2 is, based on an affirmative judgment, a creditor can seize, attach, freeze the assets of the debtor, and based on that lien, all kinds of synonyms for the same word, so you take control with some public officers of that asset, and then not to own that asset, but to sell the asset on a market and distribute the revenues to yourself, and if there's an excess of the auction, then it is for the original owner. So in plan B, if the primary performance fails, then it is about assets in a 2-step approach. First, you need to know for sure with a judgment in court that there is that entitlement, and then you translate the entitlement to liquidity, to a monetary value, also called damages or similar words. So this is the picture. And then the question is, from the perspective of a creditor, what are the options? And who are the creditors? A list of creditors are employees, for a salary, suppliers for the stuff they supply, customers for the product they purchased and potential product liability, the banks for loans, and so forth. And then the options. We could look at the assets of the owner. I introduced the entrepreneur, those 22 years old engineers with a good idea, and they have assets, they have property. They have a bicycle, they have a laptop, they have a bed, so their assets are limited. So if you look at that person from a plan B perspective, then the owner in that stereotype inventor picture is not worth that much. Secondly, you could look at the financer. So who is putting the assets, the working capital into the company? If that is a bank, or if there is another professional finance provider, then there is a problem in terms of plan B. Why? Because if you provide finance, you want certain security in return. And security is not meant in the word that the shares are a tradable object and then called securities in the United States of America. But here I use the word security as in collateral, as in recourse. And those are legal arrangements in the sense that if you provide 1 million of initial capital, let's make a balance sheet. So here on T1 we have a initial investment of a bank. So this is debt finance. So 0 equity finance and 100% debt finance. And on T1 it's cash. And then T2, so the day after, they purchase a plant. The balance sheet is still the same. 100,000 debt finance, 0 equity finance, and the value of the plant is 100,000. And then collateral, then security is that there is a mortgage, a private law arrangement, that in case of plan B, in case of debt, in case of default, the bank, the debt financer, is the first creditor entitled to the proceeds of that asset. And in that context, I call it the assets of the financer. When? In plan B, not in plan A. Plan A is, with the plant, we produce products. But we talk about this second scenario. The third option is that you look at the creditor. Same story, but creditor as in supplier. You could have a balance sheet in which there's a machine provided by a supplier, but with retention of title. That means that the object that is in your plant is not owned by you as entrepreneur, but on lease, so to speak. So you borrow the object until you have paid the full purchase price, and at that moment, ownership of that object, cars, machines, supplies, are then transferred in ownership. Then the security of the creditor is that the company, owns the supplies until the full price is paid. So here are options, and the last option is obviously the classic one, that the company owns the day 4 is the company owns the house, and then it is 100% equity, and 0%, well, not necessarily, but for my example, and then a sort of unburdened piece of asset in the legal person, and that was one of the definitions of a legal person. Remember week 1, a entity by law that is able to own an asset. If you have those options, then the question, also answered in the book, is how do you choose in such a way that there's a nice balance between the rights of creditors and the interests of the entrepreneur. And then there are 2 strategies. The one is called affiliation strategy, known to you, and the other one is the rule strategy. What does affiliation strategy mean in this context? It means that the future creditor analyzes the asset options prior to the initial deal, be it the sale of stock or the employment contract, etc. And how can you analyze such a plan B asset situation? By analyzing information. How do you get that information? Based on the providing of that same information by the enterprise itself. How does law kick in? That it sets certain standards pertaining to that information. Standard number 1 is you should not lie. You should not fix your balance sheet or your information pertaining to the assets in this case within this affiliation strategy. But that is almost it in that strategy, because it's a sort of free market approach. Based on that information, a creditor should decide itself what type of risk it should take, with or without collateral, etc. So that is the affiliation strategy. So not a real solution. It's just a, in terms of transaction costs, a sort of preliminary analysis of the asset situation, and then based on your gut feeling as a creditor, you say yes or no. Example. Then we have the rule strategy, and that is the infamous minimum capital approach. So you could say in a scenario of default, well, what if we force the enterprise, the legal person, to keep a certain minimum of reserves, assets, with the purpose to satisfy claims of creditors. And especially on the continent, but in the past also on the other side of the ocean, the legal systems required at the establishment of a corporation that a minimum capital was provided. But that is gone away almost. Why? Because after you establish the initial working capital, the day after you could purchase material, cars or whatever machines that you think are useful for your enterprise. And there's no guarantee that the value of those purchases on behalf of the legal person, that value stays at the same level. And I always use that example of the ice block industries in the 19th century. They purchased with the minimum capital, they purchased machines and ships and special devices to cut ice blocks. But after the invention of the refrigerator, that value evaporated. So on a balance sheet perspective, the minimum capital looks nice, because then you have value on the left side. But the moment you purchase return on investment creating objects, machines, employees, etc., and then that initial capital is consumed. And that's the reason why, and many other reasons, that the jurisdictions decided in the last couple of decades to abolish minimum capital. But it still exists. When you want to establish a public limited liability corporation in the Netherlands, a NV, or in other jurisdictions, in the Netherlands it's, for instance, 40,000 euro you need as initial capital, which is not a lot of money, but that means it's at least a sort of hurdle on your side to establish a NV. because that is not necessarily an amount of money you have as a student. So it's a little hurdle, but not necessarily a huge hurdle. But when it comes to Plan B, the default scenarios, it is not, it's sort of meaningless. The same applies to the echo of this thinking, for instance, in the financial sector. We saw and we see that, for instance, in Basel IV, the international financial service providers industry agreed, G20, on higher standards of the balance sheets of banks and insurers. I believe by heart that we should have 7.6% of the equity in free floating reserves, or a number like that, 10-ish%. Someone in the room who knows the exact percentage? Basel IV? No? Okay. Not very important. What I want to say is that it's the same thinking as the minimum capital, but also such a minimum will not work in a situation where all the customers of a bank do a bank run, then even with 7.6% reserves, or 10%, or let's make it even 30%, those banks will fall. So the whole idea that a minimum capital is a guarantee for creditors is most likely, based on experience in the past, not very helpful, but it is an echo of a desire of creditors, because they need, or they think that they need a certain protection. Well, let's move to that Plan B. Let's move to that scenario at the end of the life cycle, the bankruptcy, where the company is in default. And let's look at the asset partitioning in that moment. And let's apply the 5 basic functions of corporate law on this situation. And here we have a bankruptcy where we have creditors that are collectively then the owner, so to speak, of the assets. Bankruptcy is defined as a general freeze of the assets on behalf of the creditors, and then not the legal person is the owner, but indirectly the creditors are. So they assume they take the position of the original shareholder. That's step 1. Step 2 is that those assets are comparable to a legal person. They are a bundle of potential meaningful contracts, and they could be, as if it was a legal person, be sold in the composition they were when they were a regular company. And that is, in other words, when you sell or restart a company out of bankruptcy. In Dutch, a doorstart. That is the situation that the creditors have the most out of their assets when they sell the operating assets, so the plants and the supplies and the employees as a bundle to a new owner. And who is then the third function? Managing this all. And that is a trustee. In bankruptcy law, in all the jurisdictions, that is called trustee, or in Dutch curator. And that is comparable to delegated management. So here we have a bankruptcy where the legal person is sort of dead, the assets are alive and kicking, they are operated by a trustee on behalf of the creditors, who are sort of investor owners, and there's limited liability. The trustee is not liable, he did not ruin the company, that was the original management. The creditors are also not liable, they have a claim on the asset. And then the fifth element, it is also transferable. The claim of a creditor on the assets is something you could trade. And that fifth item of the 5 components of corporate law is at the root of the financial crisis. Because in each securitized financial arrangement, this plan B is regulated in the contract. And when these assets are American homes with homeowners and a mortgage, and you have millions of those assets in different legal persons, and you bundle that in the contract, then that bundled contract is something you could start selling. And that is one of those securitized products that were on the market prior to the financial market. And then it caused the financial crisis. Why? Because the underlying value of all those homes was not what the information said it was. Or put or phrased in a different way, the valuation of those assets on the market in which that plan B was sold was not done correctly. But it was a very attractive type of financial product on the market. There are beautiful movies and documentaries on it, up to and including that municipalities, for instance in the Netherlands, started, and Italy and all kinds of other countries started to purchase those products as a investment. And then there was a sort of snowball effect that the original contract, so the original picture, the green relationship, homeowners started to default, and then as a snowball, all kinds of companies involved in this fell. What we see in terms of asset partitioning is a second asset, the home of the original shareholder. And not on the picture, but you could also see a home of the original manager. Those assets are the potential recourse when the limited liability is taken away. We discussed limited liability last week, and one of the risks as a shareholder and as a manager, especially as a manager, is that there is no limited liability. If your managerial performance is outside the reasonable standard. And then all of a sudden, whatever I said on the corporation and its assets also applies to that manager and to a lesser extent to the shareholder. What does share or asset partitioning mean? That means that prior to an arrangement, you have this picture in your mind and you ask yourself, when I am ending up in this situation, plan B, how is then the assets, how are they divided over the different persons, and how are they protected and shielded from relationships, and how can, by contract, how can I change the negative consequences? So that is asset partition. Then let's skip the establishment and the review of articles of incorporation. Let's have a quick look at the other aspects. This is a list of the conceptual phases in bankruptcy, and we touched upon that. Maybe we highlight that an individual creditor has an individual right on foreclosure of an option. So if you have a large company and there's one creditor in one country that has one big claim, let's say $100,000, and the company does not pay, then that individual creditor can sue that subsidiary and seize an object, let's say a company car, color television, and get it. That does not mean that there's bankruptcy. That is just one default, and then each creditor has that right. Bankruptcy is defined as a collective seizure of all the assets. How do you know? By a filing, a bankruptcy filing. And there are two parties who could file. That are those creditors. For instance, in the Netherlands, at least two. That is a sort of minimum requirement in most jurisdictions. And but also the management itself can file for bankruptcy, and that's a sort of voluntary. So, and as of that moment, the rights of individual creditors cease to exist. Then you are all of a sudden in the bundle, in the basket of all the creditors. So that's the importance of the filing. And I mentioned the trustee, the management of the assets, the sales of the asset, the distribution of the proceeds, and the liquidation. And obviously, when it comes to distribution of the proceeds, there is never enough. Because the whole reason that there is this bankruptcy is that there was apparently not a possibility of refinancing. Refinancing as in that a new bank issues new debt financing. Why? Because there's not enough collateral. And that's a sort of sign that there's not enough value in the company anymore. And this is an example of such a legal rule around the bankruptcy filing, and the literal phrasing is that such a debtor, a company in our case, shall be declared bankrupt by court order when? Where it has stopped to pay his due and demandable debts. So that's a factual observation that debts are not paid. Not whether they could be paid, but the assessment whether they are paid. So if you refuse to pay, then you are eligible of being declared bankrupt. In the United States of America, this is the famous Chapter 11 you heard about in newspapers, article or paragraph 541. Then you look at the assets, paragraph A, the commencement of a case under the section of this title creates an estate. So the American word for the collection of assets is estate. And then the estate should be managed and then sold and managed as a sort of caretaker until the moment you're able to sell it. And then the proceeds of the sale are going to the creditor. And so two words, stop to pay dues, and then there's this declaration of bankruptcy, and then the assets are an estate. Yes?
What is the difference between the Article 1 and the claim of an individual creditor? It says upon the request of one of his creditors. As an individual creditor.
Then there is no bankruptcy, then there's no estate, then there's just the seizure of one valuable object, one car or one container with supplies, and that is then sold. So materially there's no difference, but the sort of formal distinction is that bankruptcy is a seizure of all the assets, so that whatever is on the left side of the balance sheet is then frozen and de-estate. And when one individual creditor is doing the same type of action, so a regular claim, and then you use different vocabulary, but substantively it's the same mechanism. Yeah, so answer to you. So to show you some hardcore laws on that topic, and that completes the week with an emphasis on this asset partitioning, what it means and how it plays a role in contracting. So in the analysis of a future deal, asset partitioning with the actors and the consequences are part of then the equation. And that concludes sort of substantively what I wanted to say on last Tuesday. So within 3/4 of an hour we managed sort of the short version. I suggest we have a 11-minute break and then the workshop with all the questions and cases that we exercise this vocabulary. Thank you very much so far.